Hello, you're watching Head to Head, and I'm Oles Gerduk. In Russian-occupied Simferopol, Crimean Tatar lawyer Emil Kurbedinov was released after spending 5 days behind bars. Kurbedinov was detained last week for a Facebook post he wrote 5 years ago. Human rights activists are convinced that the true reason for his arrest was his legal assistance to Ukrainian political prisoners. To talk more about human rights violations in occupied Crimea and about efforts to rescue prisoners of the Kremlin, we welcome to the studio today Evgenia Andreyuk, human rights activist. Hello, and thank you for being with us today.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yes, it's always a pleasure to have you here, Evgenia, and we have been repeatedly talking with you about human rights violations, about Ukrainian political prisoners, about the problems that they face in occupied Crimea and also in Russia, depends where they are being held. But this time, Russian security forces dared to detain one of the defendants of our political prisoners. What does it signal to us?
So first of all, it's a pressure to all lawyers and to all human rights defendants in occupied Crimea, where there are quite few of them, but this is also quite the systematic pressure of human rights activists and lawyers who protecting political prisoners. So I would remind that the first pressure on lawyers, which we saw in Crimea, it was in 2016, and it was first with the first detention of Emil Kurbedinov and also with kidnapping and detention of Nikolai Polozov, Russian lawyer who is also working in Crimea on political prisons cases. After that, we saw numerous cases of various types of pressure and prevention of lawyers working on their cases, well, not detentions, but for example, the prevention of secure communication with the clients, different other types of procedural guarantees violations for lawyers, while here finally we face another detention of a lawyer, and we see, and to be honest, for us working with Crimea, we think that it's quite lucky that Emil is only under administrative procedures, that he was sentenced only to 5 days of arrest,
yes.
And that is not criminal procedure. Unfortunately, each time with detention of each activist, we all are afraid of criminal prosecution.
Actually, I was about to ask you, did you expect that he will be released so fast, just after 5 days of detention?
Yeah, for sure. Like when the detention happened and when the trial was and when the accusation was on the repost on administrative procedure, this was quite predictable that it would be administrative arrest and not criminal prosecution. Unfortunately, this is also a kind of like sign that there could be afterwards the criminal prosecution, because according to the Russian legislation, if the same administrative violation repeats like 3 times twice per year, the third time is criminal prosecution. So if Emil is detained and if accused on the same offense the second and the third time during the year, the next 12 months, there would be criminal prosecution on that. This is the first point. The other point is that based on any materials that could be found on his office or based on any other grounds that the Russian occupation authorities want, there could be also criminal prosecution.
So then they can try him for the, I don't know, allegedly extremist post.
Yes, there could be 2 more reposts and there would become a criminal prosecution, unfortunately. And this is like the reality in Crimea, which everyone faces. So there have been the similar cases in Russia, for example, with Egdar Dadin, the famous case of political prisoner. So it was exactly this situation when he was accused several times during the year in administrative violation, and then finally it was criminal prosecution. So unfortunately, we were very much afraid when Emil was detained in 2016 that it would be the same situation. But
repeated.
In 2016, it was left just as administrative arrest. Whether it was just a thing like for notice, just it's difficult to say. Was it was deterrent measure, but then it was fined for 1.5 years, and now once again he's arrested. Unfortunately, except Emil, there are around a dozen of other lawyers working on such cases in Crimea, and for sure there is deterrence for everyone, for all the lawyers working with these cases, but also for human rights activists. Another danger here is the possibility of annulation of his license as a lawyer, and this is probably, I think, for Emil and his clients is for sure is the hugest danger that they face.
This is the biggest danger.
And this is unfortunately definitely also the result that could afterwards be used from the administrative offense, because then the de facto authorities can say that he is violating advocacy ethics because of administrative offenses and because of his arrest, and then afterward this could become a ground for annulation or for suspension of his license. And this is for sure, I would say probably that this would be the hugest trouble.
So this is the message from the Russian security forces not to stand up for Ukrainians, as far as I understand.
Not only for Ukrainians generally, but also for all political prisoners,
yes.
but also generally like not to oppose Russian occupational authorities in any way, because the MIG is one of those persons around whom there is the people gather together.
Yes, build confrontation.
And who is also defending those who are in trouble. So this is very clear sign that in Crimea everything should be in accordance with what Russia wants.
Yes, but what was that 5-year-old Facebook post that Russian authorities used to build their accusation on?
It's very interesting because there is the same post on which he was arrested 1.5 years ago, but 1.5
This is the same
But
one.
1.5 years ago it was Vkontakte post. It was a post in different social network. Well, now it's the same post, but only on Facebook.
This is ridiculous.
And this is a repost of the demonstration which took place in Simferopol, and while on the photo and on the publication, the Russian authorities see the symbols, the signs which are extremist, for example, the signs of Hizb ut-Tahrir party and others. But I would remind, when this post was made and when this demonstration took place in Simferopol, these symbols and this party was not prohibited and is not prohibited in Ukraine. So at the date when the post was done, everything was in accordance with the current legislation. So there is also the huge issue of retrospective application of the Russian legislation in Crimea, which like they're doing since 2014 all the time. But this is once again the post from 2014 and on the event which was absolutely legal at those time, while for Russian authorities they think that this is illegal. Unfortunately, this means that basically like everyone could be brought now to so-called justice for any post from any from whatever you started your social network. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I cannot understand their judiciary system. This is just beyond my abilities. But when Emil Kurbedinov was released from the detention center, there was a moment that surprised me the most in a good way. The crowd of people was actually waiting for him outside the detention center, the crowd of his supporters. And this is despite all the fears that this pressure of the Russian authorities could be put on them, actually. So you keep the dialogue with the residents of Crimea. What moods do they have now? How much hope and how much will?
This is paradox that the more pressure is put on several communities in Crimea, then the more solidarity they between themselves, and the more they opposite and the more to the Russian authorities in Crimea. So it's important to understand that there are several different communities in Crimea nowadays. There is Crimean Tatar community who are probably face the hugest pressure and the hugest repressions from Russian occupational authorities. However, there are also those who oppose this power and who are not afraid to do that. So those people who met Emil, there are much more those who support them, and I would say that the more repressions Crimean Tatars face,
the more resistance they build.
Resistant and the more resilience, and the more and they are still more and more persuaded that they are against Russian occupation in Crimea, and this is more and more they say that it's illegal and that Russia would never bring anything good to Crimea. However, for sure there are some groups and communities who have supported occupation, who have supported Russia. Nowadays, I would say they're not so optimistic because 5 years passed already and there are no miracles, there are no wonders, there are no prosperity. There is nothing that they had expected 5 years ago. There is nothing from the Russian promises which had become
which were fulfilled, yes.
So that's why I would say that they are not so optimistic nowadays. But nowadays, unfortunately, they would also, not all of them are ready to say that they would like to come back to Ukraine, because it's very difficult for people just to realize their mistakes and to say, that they had been wrong. That's why I would say that they are not so optimistic. But for those people who do not face repressions themselves, it's also very difficult for them to understand that it's not only the problem of broken promises, but there is also a huge problem of the pressure, of illegal arrest, of illegal detentions. And unfortunately, for those people who did not face themselves, it's very difficult to understand. It's very interesting. We have several cases of so-called Russian patriotic activists who afterwards have been detained and also accused on falsified evidence and falsified prosecution. And it's very interesting the change of their mindset from very optimistic and supportive to the Russian Federation, for sure, to very opposite. We have several cases like that quite recently.
Tell us about these cases. What was the reason to detain these pro-Russian people with their level of propaganda
I would say that
in
it's
occupied
more about local disputes. So, for example, this was quite the recent case on which the accused were sentenced, and this was in Alushta. So they have been detained, the member of the local council and the journalist, and they have been fighting, while supporting general Russian occupation, they have been fighting the illegal construction sites in Alushta near the seaside. And then afterwards, within the conflict of the local authorities, they have been detained on corruption and put in jail. And quite recently, they have been sentenced to imprisonment, while the falsified evidence it's difficult for me to say whether these people still support Russia or not. But for
I was just about to ask, what do they root for now?
Because there is no much attention, and I personally do not communicate to them what specifically on their position. But for sure, from what they're saying and from their narrative, they changed quite a lot their mindset. And we had another also similar case of pro-Russian activist who had said something against Bulgarians, and then afterwards they were sentenced on extremism, while what they said, it was really not hatred, but they was very much offended that the Bulgarians did not invite Russians to some celebration of the official holiday. And for this, they were sentenced to extremism. And after this sentence, this pro-Russian activist said that they're very much now dissatisfied with what is going on, and that they would not continue their political activities. So it's interesting.
They give up on Russia.
I would not say that this is a huge tendency, but a number of also pro-Russian activists, I would say those who also oppose both local authorities and oppose local corruption, they in the same way are persecuted. And this is, for myself, this we normally say that the thing in Crimea is not only about pro-Ukrainian activists, but about anyone who is unloyal, generally to the myth of Russian Crimea, where everything is prosperous, where everything is fine. Anyone who is opposite to general this context and to general this Russian social narrative would be in this or those way persecuted by the local authorities.
But are these cases covered by Crimean media or not?
For sure, by the official Russian media which are in Crimea, none of these cases are covered. Neither cases of this called pro-Russian activists, or for sure of pro-Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar activists. There is somewhere the coverage of independent media. If they are not blocked by the Russians, there are sometimes the opportunities for Ukrainian media, but also international media, to have their coverage in Peninsula. Unfortunately, this is not stable, but many people, and this is mainly depends on the willingness of people to have this information, because many people whom I know, they have a VPN, for example, connection, to have connection to this websites, or they have satellites in order to watch any independent TV. So unfortunately in Crimea it depends on those who want to have that. These people have access to this information. For sure, Russian propaganda is it's Russian propaganda.
Yes, of course. Well, and the very last question to ask, because we are really running out of time, what cases of human rights violations are the most flagrant right now, and what are the updates on the cases of political prisoners and prisoners of war held in Russia?
For sure, now the hugest case is Ukrainian prisoners of war which were detained in Azov Sea, and the hugest problem nowadays is that we still do not have the normal access to information on the state of health and generally on the state, and none except Ukrainian councils and several lawyers who have access to them. No one had access, and basically the relatives and also the publicity, we do not know anything about them, specifically of those who are injured, because nowadays it's 2 weeks and we still have no news about them. And for sure, generally, what is the criminal prosecution about? What are the evidence? Because this is like quite secret, at least for me, because everything is clear that there were no violation which was committed by them. So I would say now it's the urgent and the hugest case that we are working on.
This is the sad note to conclude our conversation on, but well, we have to. Let's hope that next time we meet with you in the studio, there will be some better news. But thank you so much for your interesting comments, and thank you for being a guest today in our studio.
Thank you.
That was Evgenia Andreyuk, human rights activist. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.